I'm sure some of you, or rather many of you, must be wondering why we are doing what we're doing. Why should I know so many details about Indian society? Why should I know so much about inequality and discrimination in Indian society? When you think like that, please remember my first lecture about developing a sociological imagination, the ability to transcend personal troubles and your personal circumstances to understand the larger structural whole within which all of that kind of fits, right? And the fact that sociological imagination beckons you towards an attitudinal shift, a shift which is inclusive, which is sensitive to inequality in Indian society and seeks to take a sympathetic stand towards that, right? So unless and until you go by that position, it might seem absolutely worthless to go through all this, right? So you need to kind of at least uphold some of the ideals that we spoke of in the first lecture in order to appreciate the lectures that have happened thus far. All right? Can we please settle down? Okay, so I begin with the very basic. What is social stratification? Why don't we use the word inequality instead of stratification? So stratification is actually an academic term. It's a term which is, as I've mentioned, is a heuristic device to understand the nature of inequality. Inequality is everywhere. You know, in every relationship you find inequality. But there is a pattern to that inequality, and there is something larger than that specific relationship that tells you about the nature of that inequality. And in order to comprehend the larger structure within which all social relationships are embedded, you need to understand social stratification. And academicians have developed this concept of social stratification as a heuristic device to understand the nature of inequality. All right? So stratification analysis looks at how we start in life, affects where we end up, and how parents' social position impact children's future. This goes back to what, you know, we have been talking of in the last 2 lectures with me, at least, what we were discussing, and I think even in the subsequent lectures taken by Mohua, where she did kinship and family, that somewhere much of what we do and what we achieve in life, however much we might kind of attribute it to our own skills and our abilities to really rise above our situation also circumscribe what opportunities are available to us, right? And that in some sense also reproduce the structure, the unequal structure there is in society. So social stratification is also interested in understanding how patterns of inequality reproduce themselves over generations and across space, right? And also to establish not just over time how inequality is reproduced, but across space, whether there are patterns to that inequality that are comparable. So if you're looking at caste, race, gender, are there similar patterns in these categories which actually circumscribe our world and also make our relationships unequal in various complex ways? Are there commonalities between those? And what are the differences between stratification of that of gender as against that of caste, as that against of religion? So social stratification is a concept, a heuristic device which helps you to understand inequality over generations and across categories of stratification. All right? So I hope this is sort of clear. Now the term stratification has been borrowed from geology, right? So this is the geological structure that we all are familiar with of the Earth's crust or the Earth's layer, where each of the layers of Earth are hierarchically arranged, right? So there is a hierarchy, and yet each of those layers somewhat are independent of each other, right? So they are not same, they are different, and yet they contribute to a hierarchy. So the term stratification borrows these two fundamental principles from this geological understanding of the geological strata, that of hierarchy, which is arrangement of elements in a vertical order, and difference. Can you please settle down? I mean, this is ridiculous. It's 2:10. Right? One is hierarchy, which is the vertical arrangement of all the strata, and difference, where each strata is different from the other. So there is also an assertion of difference in the hierarchy that you see. So stratification Yeah. What? I didn't get that. Heuristic. Heuristic is an analytical tool. A heuristic device means an analytical category, right? Something which seeks to dissect and investigate, the category of inequality. So stratification is that sort of a term that is used within sociology to understand the nature of inequality. Okay? So second is the principle of difference, which is again very evident in the context of understanding the various layers of the Earth's crust. Right? So two features of stratification, hierarchy and difference, and I'm giving you the formal definition here. Hierarchy implies regular ordering of a phenomenon on a continuous scale, in that the elements of the whole is ranked in relation to the whole. If you remember, we had mentioned Louis Dumont in our last class. Louis Dumont, who came up with what was one of the most dominant theories on caste in India, and we are still suffering from that sort of an imagination of caste system that Dumont kind of developed in the study of Indian society, where he understood Indian society as a hierarchical system, wherein the castes are arranged on the principle of, vertically arranged on the principle of purity and pollution. Right? So each is contributing to the whole. Each is a microcosm of the macrocosm. Right? So each caste within it encapsulate all the features of the caste system independently as well as in relation to the caste system. So somewhere the system reiterates itself through each of the layers. Hierarchy is of that kind. Difference is the horizontal placement of discrete units. For example, gender, tribe, but even these can be subject to evaluation. For example, there is no reason why women should be considered as inferior to women, but they are, right? They are different to each other. Right? Tribe and caste is different to each other. Men and women are different to each other. Right? Different categories you find, languages, they're different to each other. But what makes, say, Bengali far superior to Uriya, right? Or any other language, because there is that politics of language colonially given in the context of Bengal, West Bengal and Orissa. Or what makes, say, Tamil superior to any other language in the south, or what makes, Hindi superior to much of the South Indian languages that we know, right? Differences are also subjected to evaluation. You are selective in what you consider as worth prioritizing, right? So among women, a lot of people will come up with an argument that women are biologically inferior, they lack strength, they don't have the strength as men, and therefore they are inferior. But the point is that women are also bearer of life. And men don't have that capacity to bear life. But if that were the principle for really distinguishing between men and women, then women would be far superior to men, isn't it? So, but in our societies, mostly in patriarchal societies, you see men are considered as superior than women. Now this is just, can we speak the same language, please? This I have brought in simply to argue that it is difference that sows the seeds for discord and dissent in society, where you have the weaker people speaking in a language that the dominant don't understand, but they are nonetheless speaking a language which is discordant, which doesn't make sense to the dominant. And it's not about I speaking English and you speaking English. It's about what we are communicating. Very often if a conservative person from, a caste society were to listen to, a lecture on why caste should be annihilated, it would not make sense at all to that person, because it just doesn't gel with the ideology that this person holds, right? So difference, in every hierarchical system there is scope for difference. There is no society that's completely hierarchical without seeds of difference. And it is difference, as long as it is not directly challenging hierarchy, that allows the hierarchy to survive. So Dipankar Gupta, one of the readings that I'm going to circulate is by Dipankar Gupta and his article on social stratification, where he says that difference becomes very significant, in highly hierarchical societies, in say societies like ours, where there is great potential for change. It doesn't make sense in the context of cold societies where hierarchies are weak. For example, in some of the tribal communities where hierarchies are weak, difference doesn't make sense. They're far more homogeneous. The more hierarchical a society is, there will be greater heterogeneity. So you should never think that hierarchical societies have no scope for change or they are stifling. Hierarchical societies are discordant, right? So you have to work with that assumption there is implicit, simmering discontent or an alternative vision to how people look at that hierarchy, all right? Structure inequalities between different groups of people in a given society can be based on both tangible and symbolic goods. So stratification is not just based on money and property, but also on symbolic goods, on status, prestige, and power, right? So many of us who come from upper caste families probably are propertyless, but I think we have the greatest resource of all, which is cultural capital. We get the best of education, we go to the best of schools, we have access to all that we consider symbolic of a good life, right? Of making it big in life. So it's not just about money, like most of the middle class would probably, qualify as a propertyless class. They're into services. And yet, would not consider themselves any inferior from an upper class or the propertied. Like I would never consider, you might laugh at it, but I will never consider myself any less than the Ambanis, simply because I don't have the money that he has, right? So because I strive and survive by and derive a sense of dignity and pride in the cultural and social resources that I have, isn't it? So stratification is not as simple as you have money and therefore you higher up in stratification. It is a complex web between tangible and intangible goods, both symbolic and tangible goods, objectively ascertainable, right? So there are cold facts about stratification and there are warm facts of stratification. What are cold facts? Cold facts are those which can be objectively ascertained. For example, if you have a stratification based on height, or weight, or money, those are cold facts. Whoever is less than 5'7" doesn't qualify, or 5'8" now, I don't know, doesn't qualify for the All India, Miss India pageant, right? So these are cold facts. But warm facts are different. Warm facts are what people think of each other. So you might be higher up in the stratification, but people might not really think of you as higher up in the stratification. So warm and cold facts always pull each other. So there is no clear-cut stratification ever available for you to talk of in a society. So social stratification deals with how people are socially differentiated, publicly and demonstratively, right? So this is so in the study of stratification then, coming back to our definition as we started off, the emphasis is on, one, inequalities between different groups of people, right? Stratification, the study of stratification looks at inequalities between different groups of people, right? Second, intergenerational inequality. So you're not just looking at inequality at one point in time, but you're also trying to see whether the same conditions and circumstances of inequality replicate over generations, which somewhere sediment this unequal structure of society. And nature of inequalities, also, the emphasis also on the nature of inequalities and how they are systematically reproduced, right? So intergenerational and how they are systematically reproduced. I have been told that that corner is the most dangerous corner. Okay. So there are two major perspectives on stratification. There are those who approve of the existing order and those who see inequality as unjust and exploitative, and not just unjust and exploitative, but also that should be changed, right? Who seek change in the system. So there are two schools of thought. One, in favor of stratification. Two, who question stratification. So I will run you through both, okay? Now, among those who believe in stratification in society, who justify the stratification of society, the first and foremost category is the biological determinists. Biological determinists feel that inequality is natural, that you cannot, not everybody can be equal, there has to be inequality. And this was a position which was quite dominant in the 19th century. And this is the same group which supported biological determinism, which stopped women from going to work, which justified slavery, and which didn't give the right to vote to workers. So this is the same group which believed that inequality is natural, and if you disrupt that, that the natural order will collapse. That society has a way in which it brings order in society, and that order is the best possible order. So biological determinists believe in that. Eugenics. Have you heard of eugenics? Eugenics argues that intellectual and cultural characteristics are determined by heredity. Right? The fact that intellectual and cultural characteristics that you have are hereditary, they're not learnt. They come from your genetic code, right? And therefore, the inequality reflected in society is nothing but a reflection of that. Those who are intellectually and culturally more evolved are at the top, and those who are culturally and intellectually less evolved are at the bottom. Eugenics was also the basis for much of the extermination that happened of the Jews by the Nazis. This is a school of thought that even now is prevalent. It was dominant at that point in time, but even now, implicit in various ways, in certain small groups, you still find eugenics as a very important school of thought that persists. Okay? Of course, related to this was social Darwinism. Social Darwinism borrows its philosophy from Darwin's understanding of nature, right? Survival of the fittest. So social Darwinists take this principle of survival of the fittest and apply it in the context of society and say that ultimately society is competitive, and those who do well in society are the ones who are the fittest, and therefore they deserve to be at the top, right? So social Darwinists at least somewhere shifted the discourse on how inequality is natural to social Darwinism, to make it a matter of competition, right? So at least there's a way in which it moved from the natural to the cultural. So social Darwinists softened that position, where if I struggle enough and if I battle enough in life, right, I can make it to the top. So social Darwinists actually opened the gates of society to competition, saying whoever is the fittest has to survive, right? Yet the principle of inequality was still prioritized, saying inequality will occur, people are not equal, the fittest are going to survive, right? So these are the sort of views that you have that dominated initially in the 19th and even in the early 20th century, and believe me, and you would know that the basic assumptions of these schools of thought still prevail in various ways, not just in the West, but even in our society. When it comes to color, when it comes to, gender, you find similar kind of beliefs that still exist in our society. Then there are the functionalists. Now functionalists, why I have distinguished from the biological determinists, eugenists, and the social Darwinists, is because the functionalists are really not talking about inequality as natural. They're not really. They are really trying to understand functionalism as a school of thought came up in the 20th century in a big way. And it was really not interested in the question of whether men are superior to women or all of that, but they really were interested in understanding how is order maintained in society, right? The fact that you people turn up here, the fact that, everything works according to time, much of the routine goes on as it is, without anybody holding a foot ruler in front of you and saying, do this, get up at 6:30 in the morning, go to your class, go have your breakfast, go for a bath. Nobody tells you that. Life carries on. And functionalists basically argue that, there is a natural order to society, and we need to understand how that order comes into being, and also why people conform. Why do people conform? Right? Of course, there are legal sanctions against people who are non-conformists, but very often when you conform, you're not even thinking of that. You conform because, you're leading a life and you like to conform. Sometimes, you want to conform. You like the routine in your life. You like your everyday. You conform, right? So functionalists were basically trying to answer that question of why do people conform, and the fact that if people conform, so obviously there is a consensus across people to the way society is structured, isn't it? If there is a consensus, that means the inequality that you see in society, even regarding that, there is a consensus in society, right? And it should be maintained because it helps maintaining order in society. You try to break that consensus, there will be disorder, chaos, and that is not what we are looking for. And this is a time, early 20th, late 19th century, this is a time when there's a lot of changes taking place in the West too. Western societies were changing. And there was a need to somewhere establish an order in society. And so the functionalists were keen on really arriving at those principles by which order can be maintained in society. What is this alternative order in society that you can build in modern society, which is different from the past, which was divine, supposedly divinely ordained? Right? Earlier, in pre-enlightenment times, the world is the way it is because God destined it to be like that. Post-enlightenment, if God is dead, that is what Nietzsche said, right? If God is dead and the world is not the way it is because of God, then obviously human beings have created it. And human beings have, through centuries, evolved some order in society which is meaningful, which is working, and if it's working, it's efficient enough, and therefore should be preserved. So the functionalists were largely interested in preserving the order as it was, right? So stratification system is based on a general agreement about rules and social expectations. Unequal rewards are the means by which a society ensures that the most important posts are filled by the most talented. So here again they come back to the same argument, although in a very circuitous manner, to argue that since it's an efficient system, it ensures that the best people, right, are accommodated in the most appropriate jobs. So if I'm a foreman, I deserve to be a foreman. I have demonstrated skills of being a foreman, and that's why I'm not a manager, or I'm not an owner of a factory. So if there is some order, then obviously it is efficient. Now this led to this huge debate within American sociology. This led to this debate within American sociology, and the very famous debate, which is again given in a abridged version of the debate, is given in Dipankar Gupta's book called Social Stratification, which is there in the library in the appendix, between Kingsley Davis and Tuman. There were these two sociologists. One, Kingsley Davis was the one who defended the functionalist view, saying that the most talented occupy the best jobs, and the fact that American society was a society based on achievement. If you are able enough, you will achieve what you're meant to achieve, right? So American society is an open society, it's a meritorious society, it respects meritocracy, and if you haven't reached where you've reached, it has to do with your limitations. Tuman did not agree with that. Tuman said, no, we all start off in life on an unequal basis. And even though in principle American society is an achievement-based society, there is too much inequality and stratification within that society, which inhibits achievement, the principle of achievement. So there was this huge debate that went on, to the point that you had somebody called Robert Merton in the 1960s, who wrote this fantastic book called Economy and Social Structure, where he kind of talks of what we know, and where we have also seen this film. We have seen films of this name. It's called The American Dream. So he here talks about the American dream, Robert Merton. And here he says that in America there is a discrepancy between culturally prescribed aspirations and socially structured avenues for achieving it, which leads to anomie. It leads to depression, it leads to deviance in that society, because every time someone fails, the feeling that people get in America at that point, and that was his argument, was that they failed to achieve. Not that the structure itself inhibits achievement of any kind. So which led to a lot of problems within American society, leading to anomie, leading to deviance, leading to frustration, and sort of built American society towards a materialistic culture, right? So Merton was extremely critical of this and said that no, even in a society like America, which is based on meritocracy and achievement, there are structural constraints, and that people start at different levels. right, and are unable to achieve many of their goals, right? So that is the argument that Merton made. So you have the biological determinists, you have the eugenists, you have the social Darwinists, and you have the functionalists. All four categories that sort of justified the need for stratification in society, and how status quo only reflects differential abilities among human beings and therefore should be respected, right? So this was the fundamental argument at that point in time. Now we come to the three main approaches within which I will talk of those who question stratification, right? Three main approaches to stratification. Some of you should wake up. Lady in the orange. I know it's very cozy and you get your shawls and dupattas which you wrap around you, which gives you a lot of warmth. I think it's better not to wrap yourself, yeah. Social Darwinists, I told you, no, derive their principle of understanding of understanding society from Darwin's philosophy of survival of the fittest. You know Charles Darwin? If you don't, then you need to go back and look up. I'm not going to explain who Charles Darwin was now, right? Oh, I want to finish. I have lots to do. Yeah. That's why I don't take questions, simply because all this talking starts. Please, this is the only question I'm taking and I'm proceeding. No, it doesn't. I'm not even saying that. What I'm saying is what he did was he prioritized the principle of hierarchy rather than difference. And instead of presenting that system as a system of exploitation or as a system which has ruptures within it, and the fact that this hierarchy was questionable and had been questioned through the history of India is something that he doesn't accommodate. And most importantly, what he doesn't accommodate is the question of power. Power over resources, control over resources, and political power being at the helm of how the caste system has panned out over centuries. Power he thought was insignificant to the caste system. He was interested in the caste ideology, which was basically to understand the ritual dimensions of caste. And much of the Indian scholars were very troubled by that, because if you stick by the ritual definition of caste, then it is static. It will never change. It's unchanging. If Brahmins have come out of the mouth of Brahma, they'll always be from the mouth of Brahma, right? If there are substances that are coded in you genetically, then whatever happens, whether you're poor, whether you're rich, whether you're born with it, and you pass it on to the next generation. So there is a way in which he did not accommodate notion of social change. He only accommodates the notion of social change with the coming of the British, who brought in a completely different set of an ideology. But Indian scholars were at pain to establish that even before the British ideology came, there was tremendous changes that were taking place within the caste system. Okay, we'll come to that. When I do stratification in India, I'll come to that. Now there are three main approaches to social stratification. One is the structural approach. Structural approach provides an external explanation of stratification in terms of predefined categories through which inequalities could be best explained. In this, I will be talking about two approaches, two scholars. One is Karl Marx and the other is Max Weber, right? Both Germans, right? And this particular structural view is also called an etic view. Etic view is an outsider's view. It's basically structural approaches are about approaches that are not based on the perception of people who are living in that stratified system, but really categories that are developed by academicians to understand stratification in society. Okay? And that is an ethic view, and that is an outsider's view, and that is a structural view that you have. I hope that is clear. Karl Marx. All of you must have heard of Karl Marx. Yeah, you might even know more than me then. Okay, so he lived between 1818 and 1883, which was a long, long, long time back. You might be wondering why we are still talking about him. Because I think Marx lives in various ways, you know. That's the point about how our physical existence is really inconsequential when ideas are mammoth. And I think why Karl Marx is remembered is for his ideas. And those ideas which were inspirational, which sought to kind of question the very basis of inequality in society. And I think he was the pioneer, you know, in questioning inequality and presenting inequality as exploitation of people, right? Till then, mostly what you have is a very status quoist approach to stratification, all right? Now, Karl Marx's works has its root in the late 18th century in the social and political changes brought about by the revolution of 1789 in France. And what his work actually expresses is his discomfort. His discomfort with the idealism of his time. See, this is the time when he was writing where it's after Enlightenment, where the values, principles of fraternity, equality, liberty, there was a celebration of humankind, there was a celebration of the human ability to transform society, there was a question, the divine theory of human, existence of the human world was questioned. There was a desire to understand the tremendous diversity that you saw around you. And in all that celebration, Marx actually highlighted the contradiction between political freedom and economic freedom, because what he saw was amidst that celebration that characterized France at that point in time, or even Britain or wherever, or much of Western Europe, he juxtaposed that to the material conditions or material existence of ordinary people, right? That is the time when feudalism sort of was dying. People were moving to cities. If you read Charles Booth and others who did the first surveys ever in the world, I mean the systematic secular surveys that happened, they were done at that point in time to understand the squatters and the kind of sort of population that had literally kind of moved to urban centers to work in factories, and the conditions of life was abysmal. They had very poor hygienic conditions, they were overworked, underpaid, and Marx was really interested in highlighting the condition of the workers, of the people who got liberated from feudalism, all right, because he thought that that was the best thing that could have happened in world history, where feudalism came to an end and people started moving to the cities to work. They were liberated. They were liberated of their feudal landlords, and then came into a space where workers could unite, say in a factory, could come together and see that they all had similar conditions of work, and probably also, come together and bring about the revolution that Marx had sort of envisaged. But at that point in time, he really wanted to highlight the sort of polarization that was taking place in Europe, between the workers on the one hand and the property owners on the other, right? So he sought to bring out the contradiction between the material conditions of the common man and the claims made about equality in the modern world. So for Marx, and it's in that context that he came up with the term class to explain this sort of social groups that were emerging in Europe at that point in time, to explain the working class as against the propertied class. So for Marx, a class is a group of people who stand in a common relationship to the means of production. the division between those who own the means of production as against those who don't own the means of production. So clearly he could see that many of these workers or people who got liberated from feudal landlords and all and moved, to centers of factory mode of production were getting kind of exploited for their labor, and they had nothing but their labor to sell. And they were totally dependent on the factory owners for labor, right? And that got exploited. And the capitalists, the ones who own the, industries, they are the ones who were exploiting this labor. So it's in that context he comes up with this notion of class. Class, he characterized not just class in industrial society, but in the entire world history of two polarized classes in the history, world history, between those who own the means of production and those who don't own the means of production. So he kind of, in his enunciation of world history, he begins with primitive communism, where he argued that there was no class. And from there he went to ancient society, and then he talked about feudal society, and finally to the industrial society, where there was always this contradiction between those who own the means of production and those who don't own the means of production. And it's always the owners of the means of production who exploited those who didn't, right? So what in the process, and why I'm bringing this in, is just to reiterate that what in the process he did, he sort of consolidated, right, the economic material basis for inequality in the world. I think so far nobody really had brought that to light. It was with Karl Marx that the economic basis for exploitation and the economic basis of inequality was laid in the forefront, right? So Marx is remembered as one of the pioneering contributors to the understanding of social stratification, primarily because he laid the foundation for a materialistic understanding of stratification, right? So class served as an analytical tool to trace the progressive differentiation of division of labor from a classless to a class society, as well as the vehicle of change. And for him, class was not only the basis for polarization between those who own the means of production and those who don't own the means of production, but was also the motor for change. It is this contradiction which is going to create friction and conflict, which will allow for change to take place. So he had these very famous words of, which he borrowed from Hegel, of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So he kind of took this sort of a dialectic understanding of world history, and in that for him the industrial society was definitely one of the most evolved stages of human evolution, which would finally lead to socialism. Now, the purpose of this lecture is not that, but all I want to emphasize here is that Marx laid the foundation for a materialistic understanding of history as well as of stratification in society. Weber comes a little later, sort of contemporaries and yet not contemporary. 1864 to 1920. He has a more nuanced understanding of stratification. Along with class, he introduces two more terms to understand stratification in society. That is status and party. Even his understanding of class is very different from that of Marx, because for him, class is a group of individuals who share a similar position in the market economy by virtue of the fact that they share similar economic rewards and life chances. For example, even in this class alone, the HR students, the human resource students, right, have a different market position vis-a-vis the social work students. Am I lying? Right? So your market situation determines your class. So for Weber, it was your position vis-a-vis your market, how saleable your skills are in the market and how remunerative that is, determines your class position. Not whether you own the means of production or you don't own the means of production. Of course, you own the means of production, that also constitutes a class, but largely it is your market situation that determines your class, right? And he, at that point in time, identified 4 classes. The propertied upper class, the property-less white-collar workers, the petty bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie is basically a term, it was popularized by Marx, Karl Marx. Bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Bourgeoisie was used to refer to those who own the means of production, and the proletariat were those who don't own the means of production. So petty bourgeoisie are the small owners of shops and, you know, small trading units. So Weber was basically referring to that, and the manual working class. Now your economic status, according to Weber, did not necessarily determine your social status, right? So your economic position in the market does not automatically contribute to your status in society, right? Unlike Marx, Weber was very clear on that, that status was different from class, right? Status refers to the unequal distribution of social honor, right? So status is associated with evaluation of honor and prestige. So you might do extremely well as far as your, you know, situation in the market is concerned, but that does not necessarily lead to an enhancement of your status. It might gradually do so, but does not necessarily and automatically raise your status in society, right? So in order to raise your status in society, there are other, you have to be able to get what? Prestige and honor, and you have to be recognized for that in society, for your economic status to be commiserate with your social status. Party was a word he used basically to refer to an voluntary any voluntary association which sets up an organization to achieve certain policies and ends. Example, political parties, social clubs, and with more mundane objectives. And he was largely looking at those who were really disprivileged as far as status and class was concerned. And he was looking at trade unions very, you know, significantly when he was talking about party. When you don't have status and a position, a class position in society, the only other way to procure any benefits in society is by political mobilization. And you find associations, clubs, trade unions coming up at that time when he was writing, where he looked as that also as an important, you know, dimension of stratification. So an individual stratification position depends on their overall location in all 3 sectors: caste, status, and party. But her class, status, and party positions may not be identical, right? You've heard of the newer rich. Who are the newer rich? Newly rich. Now, there are lots of writings that in English, they came out in the 19th century and early 20th century, which actually are based on this conflict between the newer rich and the aristocracy, right? Even when, I don't know whether there used to be this very, it's based on a book about all this, the British who came through the East India Company, the Britishers. Many of them accumulated tremendous amount of wealth in India and sought to kind of gain sort of status when they went back to Britain, but was not readily kind of available to them because there was a resistance on the part of the old rich or the aristocracy. And that is what Weber refers to as social closure. That very often, even if you gain wealth, status might not come your way, right? Because there is solidarity within social groups, which is reinforced by conflicts between social groups. So even if, you know, you gain the wealth and you have the influence, political influence, still you're not able to make way into the circles that you want to be part of as a part of the status group. You're not able to do that. So this is just a cartoon to talk about how the newer rich might be referring to the aristocracy, where she says, yes, Sir Henry is owed money, but only because he never spends any of it. So she's obviously sarcastic and says he's owed money, all right, but where's the money? I mean, he doesn't spend it, he doesn't show it, doesn't demonstrate it. So what sort of an old money is that? So it's in one way to ridicule the status of the aristocracy that you find here. Oops, jumped. Okay. Then there are these two other approaches. Good morning, good afternoon. Abhi aa rahe ho? Don't tell me you found my lecture so inspiring that you came in front of me. Very difficult to believe, but anyway. I myself am not convinced of it, so. Anyway, so besides the structural approach, there are two more approaches. One is the interactional approach and the relational approach. I will try to go quickly through these because I want to come to stratification in India, which most of you would be really interested in. And I know you're very interested in the question of caste. Yes. I don't know why, but yes, okay, we'll come to that. But the interactional approach seeks an insider's view, which is an emic view. I talked about the etic view, about the structural approach, outsider's view. This is an insider's view. Emic view is an insider's view. Warm facts. You want to know how people themselves think about inequality, right? How inequality is perceived and reproduced in society. And then there is the third, which is the relational approach, which seeks to comprehend how differential access to resources, information, people and places help to organize unequal class and status relations, or in other words, how class, status and power work in everyday life and reproduce inequality. So the relational approach is really not that complicated, it's simple, but what it tries to do is it takes these mammoth terms called caste, status, party, power, and really tries to see how it unfolds, right, in the context of everyday life. What does having a high position in class mean? Or what does having a high status mean in everyday life? How does class work its way in allowing that inequality to get reproduced? So the relational approach is really interested in understanding how these categories come to life in the context of relationships between people, in the context of social networks among people, all right? So that is the relational approach. So interactional approach is largely looking at how people perceive inequality rather than how sociologists are trying to look at it and creating like sort of systems of understanding stratification. And relational approach is about how many of these huge categories work or pan out in the context of everyday life, right? Working in favor of some and disadvantaging some others, all right? So the interactional approach, this approach uses patterns of social interaction and distance to determine the nature of the stratification order, how people see inequality, how do they define social distance in the process. So largely about that. So this is my favorite stand-up comedian, George Carlin, right? Have you, anybody? You have, right? So this is because we were a poor area, the school had a small budget and was unable to teach the second half of the alphabet. So here's a perception of inequality where he's saying, well, it's obviously a tongue-in-cheek comment. It's basically trying to say that, this is silly. Just because, you're poor, you're denied education. What is the point to this? So this is one perception. And so this is another. He was born with a silver spoon or he was born with a silver spoon, all right, but not in his mouth. So this is a perception of, somebody being very kind of snobbish and really not interactive and trying to, who thinks no end of himself and obviously sees himself as a different class or belonging to a separate status, and the women were saying obviously he's a pain in the ass. So this is the point so the fact is that you might think you belong to a very kind of evolved class and you have pure blood running through your veins, or you might be the blue-veined, right? But Ask the people who are, bearing the brunt of your arrogance, and they will tell you where you stand. Okay, so there's a study that was done by David Cannadine called Classes in Britain in 1998, where he speaks of 3 models. क्या हो गया भाई, खांसी हो गई है? Should I break you guys up? Huh? Please come. You're wasting my time because you have to sit here from 2 to 6. There's no option. जा तो कहीं सकते नहीं. बैठ जाए आके आगे. Come. There's some Fevicol. You can put them in that Fevicol का मजबूत जोड़ ad. Refuse to move. Anyway, so David Cannadine speaks of 3 models with which people attempt to make sense of the unequal social worlds they inhabit. The hierarchical view of society is a seamless web, right? So largely, basically, held by those who are at the top of the hierarchy, right? The powerful, who see society as a hierarchy, right? We are the most superior, the rest are the masses. We are the class, rest of the mass. So almost like a seamless web of hierarchy. Now, it's getting a bit much. Jokes apart, those who have cough will be thrown out. No, don't keep coughing unnecessarily, it's distracting. Can we settle down? Can we settle down, please? Largely otherwise, people hold a triadic vision of upper, middle and lower groups, where you constantly, if you're a lower group, then you refer to the middle class, you don't refer to the upper. If you're upper, you're referring to the middle. So there is this 3 classes that are constantly referred to, the upper, middle and the lower. Then there is the dichotomous categorization of us versus them, which is context specific. Largely in the context of some conflict or some interaction. For example, if a domestic worker is working in a middle class house, her reference would be to that particular house in the context of being the middle class, right? So it's in that context that us and them, the aspect of us and them will come in the context of your interaction. So Cannadine basically argued then in this context, when he talks about images of inequality, that class basically serves as a metaphor. You know what a metaphor is, right? It serves as a metaphor to really address how you perceive inequality around you, as well as, listen, I'll walk out of the class. Can we just put an end to this? So basically, what Cannadine is arguing is that it serves as a metaphor to really talk of how you look upon, other social groups and how you perceive inequality. So for him, images of inequality are claims about why inequality exists, about how unequal rewards and resources are distributed in society, justifications for as well as the need to transform social arrangements. So usually when you kind of refer to other groups and you're talking about your own experience of inequality, you're largely talking of how you visualize society to be, right, and how it is in your context. For example, in a lot of cases I have come across in my own life where there is a great importance given by those if belonging to the laboring class to izzat, mehnat ki kamai, right? They always say, हम तो मेहनत की खाते हैं. ये लोग अमीर लोग जो करें बीमार भी बहुत पड़ते हैं क्योंकि ये लोग खाते हैं उसको हजम नहीं कर पाते हैं. हम लोग मेहनत की खाते हैं. हम जो खाते हैं अपने पसीने में खाते हैं, अपने पसीने की खाते हैं, हम किसी खैरात में नहीं खाते हैं. So there is a sense in which you claim rights to the position you're in, and usually it's not a very kind of, abysmal description of your lives. You usually describe life and how you live in very positive ways. So you're making a claim to your being and how you see yourself, right? Not that you are not hit by poverty, not that you're not thinking of when the next meal or from where the next meal would come, not that you're not thinking what will happen if my child falls ill. These are concerns that plague the poor on a daily basis. But still they retrieve a sense of self and dignity in the way they live. And usually they do it by this perception of themselves in the unequal conditions that they live. So for Canondine, these would be basically metaphorical to how the poor people or the less privileged see their situation, see inequality, see those people who are placed above them, right? So here's a cartoon again. This is the rich who's saying, true, money can't buy happiness, but it can buy cognac, fine cigars, and the company of beautiful women, and these make me very happy indeed. So here's a rich person whose perception of happiness and prosperity and his class is very evident, who obviously has no, love lost for the poor, and it's this whole idea of a seamless hierarchy, that I am in this privileged position because I deserve it, and because I am there, I deserve all the happiness. So I can't buy happiness, but I can buy things that can buy me happiness. And then there is this, which says, I see the neighbors have got fire and the wheel. So here is a more contextual, context-specific sort of an assessment. When you see your neighbors saying, oh, iske paas to color TV aa gaya, or this one has got a fridge. So there is a movement, a mobility that you see, in your neighbor's life. So then you say, arey ye to pata hai kahan se aaya paisa. So we know from where that money has come. So there is that, way in which you will justify why you don't have it and the other has it. Relational approach. In the relational approach, stratification resides in the network of people's social relations, which structure differential access to resources, information, people and places in ways which help to organize unequal class and status relations. So this basically is again referring to how in the situation that you're born and you're living in, there are a whole set of social network or web of social relationships and available to you, or resources available to you, that allow you to translate your caste, your class, status and party privilege into consolidating your position and also transferring into the next generation. So here, that in the relational approach, the term that is very significant is differential association, which means people with different social resources, whether social, economic and cultural, tend to travel in different social circles, have different lifestyles, and therefore less likely to bump into those with different social groups. Now, difference association, the reason I brought this in is that in urban settings, for example in Mumbai, how do you understand stratification? The hierarchical sense of stratification is very difficult to find in the context unless you go to a specific situation where there is a caste hierarchy that emerges. How else do you understand? You realize that in cities like Mumbai, people live in various social groups. For example, I'm often asked by those who are not from Mumbai, Shah Rukh ko dekha? Did you see Shah Rukh Khan? Just because, but the fact is that I belong to a completely different social circle to that of Shah Rukh Khan, and we also circulate in those social circles, right? So this is the point about differential association, that the further or the more the social distance between my social circle and your social circle, the greater the stratification. You understand? So the relational approach also go into the question of how do you understand stratification in the context of complex societies, in urban society, where it's very difficult to pinpoint hierarchy and difference as the basis for stratification. Thus, people from different social groups inhabit different social spaces. As we grow up, our emerging tastes, preference, friends, lifestyles are shaped by the social conditions around us, which in turn influence the choices we make. So social spaces then enable a set of choices that maintain social distance and social stratification in society. Very often you make friends who sort of are similar to you, you make boyfriends who are similar to you, you make girlfriends who are similar to you, you kind of attend marriages of people who belong to, similar kind of backgrounds. It's only in a place like TIS or in the university setup, and that's why university is so unique, because it brings people from various social circles in one place. This is one film I remember, I don't remember the name, but it had Nasruddin Shah's son. Huh? In that, that Marathi actor is also there. He's huh? Shh. Acha, एक minute. Just a second. This film is basically about this boy who's obviously cosmopolitan. For him, sexuality is no big deal. Having sexual relationship is not big deal, who's very casual about life, doesn't have too many ambitions. And then there is his friend. Who's that Marathi actor? अरे यार एक को बोलने में यार. हाँ चल पड़े. Anyway, so that guy, he comes from this, I think, rural UP Bihar kind of a background, who's a student leader, and who's going around this girl who's obviously very modern and brought up in a very liberal family, who's aspiring for a career as a model, and this student leader is very possessive about her and doesn't want her to go into modeling where she has to show her body off. But her father is insisting that she should really take her career very seriously in modeling. And it so happens in this entire, there's this event of this student's election, jo abhi hone wala hai yahan pe, where this Nasruddin Shah's son and this girl get to talk to each other, and then they obviously get physical, and the student leader discovers that and is completely destroyed by the idea of his girlfriend having slept with his best friend, who also happens to be his best friend, and commits suicide in the process. So it's a classic example. It's a road accident. But whatever, he's dejected. For what I remember, it was a suicide. But whatever it is, but he's very dejected by that. So it's a classic example of this. Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. It's not anomie is too strong a word. It's basically a situation where he was, the very basis of how he viewed the world and how, for him that relationship was sacrosanct, and there's a way in which he constructed that relationship with his girlfriend, right? For him it was a sacred relationship, where I think even he didn't touch the girl for that reason. And then he finds that his friend comes and kind of consummates such a small brief meeting with her, which kind of devastates him. So it's an interesting kind of case study to really understand this whole idea of social circles. We come from different social circles which have different values, different ideologies, different ways of bringing up, and if you actually study social circles and social groups, you realize how social stratification exists in urban life and how different each social group is, right? So social class determines success, right? So now I come to India. Okay. Now in the context of India, we will go back to what we did in the last class when I had done kind of an overview of understanding Indian society. If you remember, in the context of Indian society, that the first people, the systematic secular study of Indian society really begins with the British, who sort of overemphasized and according to nationalist scholars, exaggerated the importance of caste in understanding Indian society and the nature of stratification in Indian society. Right? And it's in that context that from the very beginning, since independence, and in fact even prior to that, among nationalist scholars, there has been this debate in terms of what should be the fundamental category to describe the social reality in India. All right? Excuse me? Can you please sit down? No, please sit. I will finish in another half an hour. There's nothing to laugh on that. You can leave then. Okay, no issues. You'll get a break. Let's settle down. Please. Right? So there was this entire sort of debate on what should be the fundamental category to describe social reality in India. Is it caste or class? Right? So this has been sort of the central aspect of the debate on the nature of social stratification in India. Now there have been three perspectives of caste that have emerged thereafter, right, in understanding the nature of social stratification in India. And largely Indian society has been understood from the prism of caste. I've told you already in my last lecture. Right? What are these three perspectives? One is the Indological perspective, which we spoke about last time, which was caste as a hierarchical system based on the principle of purity and pollution, a system which is unique to India that you don't find anywhere else, largely a view held by Dumas and much of the Orientalist scholars, including Max Weber, who saw purity pollution as fundamental to defining the stratification in the caste system, and therefore a system based on consensus and a system that is static, that has not really changed over time. The second position is caste as a system based on hierarchy and difference, evident in the innumerable efforts towards mobility. Remember when we did M.N. Srinivas, we did Milton Singer, we did Robert Redfield, I talked about McKim Marriott, I mentioned all these names last time. And largely to talk about how Indian scholars were at pain to demonstrate how dynamic Indian society has been and how there have been umpteen efforts to really challenge the caste system that have taken place in Indian society. And it's in that context that people like Dipankar Gupta, A.M. Shah, M.N. Srinivas, all of them argue for the second principle of stratification in understanding the caste system, which is difference, saying that yes, it's a hierarchical system, but difference is as fundamental in understanding the caste system, which again sows the seed for discord within the caste system, and therefore there is a need to understand caste as an ever evolving and dynamic system, right? And the fact that it's a system which might be there only in India, but it's not unique in the sense that it is like any other system of stratification. In fact, Dipankar Gupta in the article that I'll be circulating compares caste to race and shows how in certain matters caste and race are the same and on certain others it's not. Because in caste, the distinction between the upper and the lower caste is based on the principle of the coded substance, tattvas, right? That the upper caste have purer substance and lower castes have impure substances, and therefore this distinction. In race, it's phenotypical differences in terms of the skin color that you find. And yet, untouchability is practiced in caste system, not in the racial system. Because you had blacks who used to work in the houses of whites. They would go into the kitchen, they would be cooks, they would be managing the household. But in a Brahmin household or an upper caste household, till very recently or even now, the lower caste who are considered as the impure caste will not be allowed inside, right? Because they're considered as impure. So there is very strong sense of untouchability. So he goes into details of that to talk about it. The third perspective is caste as a system of exploitation. And strangely, none of the leading scholars of India really talk about it. It's the Dalit perspective really which brings out this dimension. And this dimension will be discussed by Professor Ramaiah in the next class, where he's going to present to you the Dalit perspective. So I'm not going to go into that. But there's one more perspective which is very marginal in the study of caste, which is the Marxist perspective. And I think the Marxist perspective is interesting because, one, it is, other than the Dalit perspective, if there's any perspective which looks upon caste as a system of exploitation, it is the Dalit perspective, the Marxist perspective. And it is a perspective unlike the other two positions, which really focus on the cultural dimensions of caste. The Marxist perspective focuses on the material dimensions of caste, the economic basis of caste inequality and exploitation. So it's the Marxist perspective which brings in very strongly the notion of exploitation and tries to show the parallels, between caste exploitation and exploitation based on economic differences, right? And I will take examples of that too. Now, before we go to the details of the perspective, I just want to run you through, we've been talking about caste and caste and caste without going into the features of the caste system. So the first time it is G.S. Ghurye, a very famous sociologist, who comes out with the features. What are the features of the caste system? What is the caste system? The first feature, hierarchy. So as I told you, the nationalist scholars never said that there is no hierarchy, but they talk about segmentation within the caste system. But when Ghurye talks of hierarchy, he's not talking about a pan-India hierarchy. He's talking about regional hierarchies. He's talking about multiple hierarchies. And he argues that each linguistic region, you can find 200 to 300 subcastes, which are set in a hierarchy. So the hierarchy that you say find in Maharashtra, you will not find in Kerala. Or what you find in UP, you will not find in Maharashtra. So different regions have different hierarchies. So he acknowledges the role of hierarchy, but he says it differs from linguistic region to another, one linguistic region to another. Second, he talks about the segmental division of society, that castes are actually quasi-sovereign. By quasi-sovereign, he means that they take care of much of the requirements of the community among themselves. So if there's a Dhobi community, it takes care of all its cultural, political, economic concerns amongst itself. Of course, they're part of the village economy, so they're quasi-sovereign, and if there is any conflict or something which occurs between a Dhobi and somebody from another caste, of course, there is a village panchayat will be called, and there'll be somebody who will arbitrate. But largely these are quasi-sovereign groups. Third, he talks about cultural differences between castes. That not only are they placed in a hierarchy and they're segmented and they're quasi-sovereign, but they're also culturally different. They have their own deities. For example, the region that I come from, the deities which are worshipped by the Brahmins is very different from the deities that are worshipped by non-Brahmins. Among the non-Brahmins, the Shetty community, who's called the Bunts, they worship ghosts. They have their own ghosts that they worship, and they have their own priests, right? Similarly, other communities also have their own deities who they worship. So there is, sort of cultural differences also among caste that he identifies. Then he goes on to restrictions of feeding and social intercourse. Kacha and pakka food. Kacha food is food cooked in water, primarily. Pakka food is cooked food. Kacha food is also raw food. Raw food and food which is boiled in water like rice and all is kacha food. Pakka food is fried, cooked food, right? So there are a whole lot of restrictions on from whom you can take kacha food and from whom you can take pakka food. And this varies again from region to region. In one place, for example, Dipankar talks of an example where the Panchal caste will take food from the Brahmins. In another place, probably they will not. And there is a place where Brahmins will take food from meat eaters, and another place probably they will not take food from anybody. So there are these
regional differences which are very difficult to bring under the rubric of one sort of categorization. Then there's the prevalence of untouchability. And untouchability is something that seems to be common across India. And untouchability, Gure talks about untouchability as it was practiced in Pune, where the untouchable castes were not allowed to come out after 6, simply because they had longer shadows, and therefore they were asked to kind of reach wherever they have to before 6 o'clock. So, and in certain areas in the south, I don't know whether you've seen Diksha, that film by U.R. Anantamurthy, which was made in Kannada and then remade in Hindi. There you see Nana Patekar, walking with a broom tied at his back. So, as he's walking, his footprints are being kind of erased. So, yeah, he was not so. Untouchability means that you don't have access to upper caste households, you're not even supposed to touch them, and there's a very moving scene in that, where a Brahmin boy who's very intrigued by Nana Patekar, the untouchable worker of this family, who wants to give him a laddu, a sweet, and is also aware that he's not supposed to touch him. And there is that moment between, this untouchable worker, that's Nana Patekar, and this boy that transpires, where they bond, and yet this entire experience of untouchability comes in the way, and finally he gives the laddu by throwing it like this, and Nana Patekar catching it. So untouchability is not just of that variety. Untouchability of various kinds exist in the caste system. There is temporary untouchability, there is permanent untouchability. With the untouchable communities, it's permanent untouchability. But temporary untouchability, menstruating women, they are temporary untouchables. People who are undergoing death rituals, who have going through the 13-day ceremony, they are temporary untouchables, right? Somebody who comes back from a cremation ground, they are temporary untouchables. So there is a way in which purity and pollution works in different ways. Somebody kind of marries out of caste, that community becomes untouchable, they are ostracized. Previously, so there are various experiences of untouchability, but largely that has stayed with us is permanent untouchability, where a certain section of our population is deemed as untouchable. And even now, it plagues us, right? Then there is, of course, restriction of marriage, restricted to subcaste. It's not just marrying, say, Brahmin marrying Brahmin, but it's also, say, Brahmin marrying a Vaishnava Brahmin, and among Vaishnava Brahmin, and another, subset of that Vaishnava Brahmin. So, subcaste sort of marriage has always been the rule. Of course, that has now become a little flexible, because now the idea is that as long as you marry in your caste is enough. If you remember that cartoon where it's Canadian, Pakistani, I don't care, but you marry a Brahmin. So as long as you marry a Brahmin or you marry a Rajput, it's fine. It can be from Rajasthan, it can be from UP, it can be from anywhere, but let him be a Rajput. So there is a way in which these rules have become flexible, but one should not mistake it to be flexible simply because what it's trying to do is somewhere again hold on to the principle of endogamy. Now, civic and religious disabilities and privileges of the different sections. Segregation of houses. Even in the villages now, if you go in India, you find caste-wise segregation of houses. The Brahmins and the non-Brahmins don't live together. Among the non-Brahmins, the twice-born don't live with the Shudras. Right? So there is a distinction. The untouchables, of course, live outside of the village. So if you were to ask the untouchable, ex-untouchable communities how they look at the village or how they view the village, for them, the village actually does not exist. Village is something that is behind the wall. They only go there for work. Village doesn't belong to them. Right? Village actually belong to the proper deed, the one who actually are dominant in that village. So the clear-cut segregation. In fact, in the fieldwork that I did, say in Tuljapur near Osmanabad in Maharashtra, the placement of the houses are also on the basis of how the wind blows. So mostly the untouchables the wind should not blow from the untouchable hamlet to the upper caste. It should be the other way around. So even the way in which the village settlement is, if you see, clearly there is a way in which untouchability is kind of prevalent in the way in which people are settled in the village, right? Access to water, you can't have the same access to water. In the 1960s, there was sort of almost like a silent revolution across Maharashtra, where untouchable communities have, mobilized themselves to get access to common wells, which otherwise they did not have, right? So there has been this effort on the part of this large section of our society to really have access to many of these facilities. They were not supposed to possess gold. They were not supposed to have pakka houses. Even now, if you go to North India, many of the untouchable communities, you will not find pakka houses. And even if they have the money, they cannot make those pakka houses. They can't eat in silverware. They can't eat in, they have to eat only in earthenware. They can't wear chappals. There are all sorts of restrictions that there were on the lower strung of our society. So there were civic and religious disabilities and privileges that were there for the different sections. Lack of unrestricted choice of occupation. So if you were born in a particular occupation, you remained in that occupation, right? So if you're born a dhobi, you remain a dhobi, or washerman. Like if you're born a blacksmith, you remain a blacksmith, except for two occupations which were still open. That was for agriculture and trade. These were two occupations where you find other castes also participating. Now, M.N. Srinivasa's only kind of further explicates on Gure's views, which is basically also considered as the field view, as against the book view of Dumont. Dumont's view was largely based on the reading of Sanskrit text, of course interspersed with some amount of field work, but M.N. Srinivasa's hardcore field work, where he distinguished between Varna and Jati. Varna is that four categories that made up the caste system, which is called Varna. Varna literally translates as color. So there are the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas and the Shudras. That's the hierarchy of the Varna, right? And this particular ideal type of caste system takes different forms in different parts of the country. But this is a pan-Indian model, right? Jati is the operational, functional unit of caste. So largely people will not say कि मेरा caste ये है. They will say मेरा जात. मैं इस जात का हूँ. So the word usually is used in जात. Even in the south they will say jati, nanna jati in Kannada, right? They will say nanna jati idu. So right, this is my caste. So jat, jati, these are terms which are locally used, and that is the operational unit of a caste, right? And again he sort of established the fact that each jati is very proud of its identity, however low, right? They have a sense of belonging to their jati. So the principle of difference is very strong. And then there are multiple hierarchies, both secular and ritual. Ritual hierarchy, the Brahmin will be at the top or whatever, but there is the dominant caste. The secular hierarchy will be based on the fact as to who is dominant. So in the north, for example, Brahmin is a completely no do-gooder, right? Brahmin is insignificant in the dominant caste model in the north. In ritual hierarchy he might be high, but in the secular hierarchy you don't find him. But in the south, the Brahmin was dominant till of course land reforms happened and anti-caste movement took over, where Brahmins were displaced from their privileged position in the south of India. Then there are of course regional differences, which I have already spoken of. Then comes Dipankar Gupta, who really establishes the importance of the principle of difference in understanding stratification in India. That ultimately what predominates in understanding of caste in India is difference and not hierarchy. Hierarchy, according to him, is very insignificant, unoperational in everyday life. What really matters is the principle of difference. Difference between us and them, between equal ranking castes. For example, if you in Maharashtra, the Mahars and the Mangs and the Domes, they all come from, quote unquote, the ex-untouchable communities. But they still will not intermarry. One will consider the other inferior, right? So there is a sort of us and them even among the lowest as among the highest. For example, among the Brahmins at one point in time in the area that I come from, the Havyaka Brahmins, who are the agriculturists, the Brahmins who took to agriculture, who were really not into priesthood or whatever, and some of them actually did death rituals. Because of that, they were never made to sit in the same line to eat. So there's a word called Adda Pankti. Adda Pankti means diagonal. So they will always sit diagonally to have food. That was basically done to mark them out as inferior to the other Brahmin communities. Of course, that was contested by the Havyaka Brahmins, and they never really believed that. But the fact is that there is ways in which within the same caste, you find this sort of a tussle for who is superior and who is inferior. Right? Caste is discrete units. This even Ghure talked about. Different customs, beliefs, ritual practices, and different equally ranked jatis. So, very interesting example that Dipankar Gupta takes is of the Mogavera. These are the fisher folk in South India, in Karnataka largely. And among them, there are 3 endogamous subcastes. They are fisher folks. And among them, there are 3 endogamous groups. And one is matrilineal. So the Aliya Santana, Aliya means brother-in-law, actually in Kannada. So Aliya Santana is actually a matrilineal group. So among them, you have differences of those kind also. So these sort of cultural differences, complex differences, rich differences, we somehow completely ignore because we just want to get a grasp of, this larger sense of caste. But caste is far more, complex, far more nuanced and far more complex for us to really kind of comprehend it in this idea of hierarchy. Brahmin is a fiction. In many communities in India, Brahmin does not officiate functions. The biggest example is of the Lingayats. The Lingayat is a dominant caste and a very strong Hindu community. Custodians of Hinduism, you can easily call them the custodians of Hinduism at this point in time in Karnataka, very strongly Hindu. These are people, and they're Shaivites. They have their own priests. Even among the lower castes, many of them have their own priests. Among the Mahars now, the Neo-Buddhists, they have their own priests. They don't call Brahmins. Brahmin actually is a fiction. So Dipankar actually demonstrates how the Brahmin is actually not that important in the caste system, and this is how Duno actually completely, presented a very warped or a very skewed understanding of the caste system. And also that there is not just one ideology, but there are multiple ideologies within the caste system. So he gives example of the Chandals and the Chamars, the 2 untouchable communities, very famous untouchable communities, because also among them the great amount of mobilization has also happened. And among them there are tales which really talk about how they were once upon a time Brahmin, and they actually fell from grace, primarily because the upper caste of the Brahmins tricked them. So they talk about how there were 4 brothers or 3 brothers, and they were the youngest, and how there was a carcass as they were going across the forest. There was a carcass which none of the brothers wanted to remove, but the younger brother was nice enough, who kind of offered his services, and because he touched that carcass, he was deemed as untouchable. So there is a sense of how they were tricked into being lower caste or untouchables. So there are multiple ideologies, that there is no acceptance of hierarchy within the caste system. Then there is muddled hierarchies. Muddled hierarchies, castes may have different positions in hierarchies across regions. He gives example of the Gwalas, which are basically the cattle tenders. In Orissa, they have a higher status. In West Bengal, they don't have a higher status. Similarly, he gives the example of the Patidars of Gujarat, who earlier claimed Kshatriya status, later then, claimed backward caste status. So there is a constant mobility, and there are differences across regions as to where you are in the hierarchy. Then there are ritually low castes are as strict about caste taboos. So here he mentions example of how many of the smaller castes or the non-Brahmin castes don't even accept food from Brahmins. So one would expect everybody to take food from Brahmins, but there are lots of communities in India who will not take food from any other caste but their own, right? So he gives example of that to say that, even caste is maintained even among the lower castes. It's not just about the upper caste. And the Kurichin of Malabar, basically again, sort of now the tribal community, but also considered as untouchable at one point in time, plaster the house with cow dung if it is polluted by the entry of a Brahmin. So Brahmin as a polluter comes out as a completely, and it's a fact. I mean, I've read Renfels, who talks about this case in great detail as to how the Kurichin would shed themselves into the houses. And if Brahmin were to pass, they will start throwing cow dung at him to avoid him to, not allowing him to cross. In fact, I have this very funny example. When I was working in Jharkhand, I was doing my field work there, and there was this, Panditji or the Brahmin who would cross every day with a potli. You know what a potli is? Sort of a bag where you basically tie a cloth and carry something in it. I used to go, and there were these little tribal kids, probably also lower caste kids among them, who would run behind this Brahmin and sing along, and always, every day, and I would always, every day witness it, saying, Pandit ji ke potli mein kya hai, anda hai, just because I wanted to irritate him. Just to irritate him. So, and they would keep singing, and he would go, and then they'll run back, and then go again. And I used to wonder why they do it. And this sort of ridicule showed to the Brahmin there, and just because anda is or the egg, the mention of the egg would instigate him. So, this idea that caste system is also something which is like oppressive and whatever, which it is. But the fact is that there are ways in which, yeah? Can I just finish it? I only have 15 minutes. I want to finish it, then I'll take questions. But why didn't you ask? Later you should have said, no, ma'am. I was not allowed, or after my lecture I told you to ask. आप तो सो गए थे मुंह खोल के. मतलब मेरे गिरबान में दाग है, आपके नहीं है. हद. You ask me questions. After I finish, you ask me questions. Let me finish right now, and I will take your question. Don't worry, I will take your question. So the questions he poses these central questions. I'm not going to go into answers for these questions. I'm just going to read out these questions, which are very pertinent in the way in which he questions Dumontian understanding of caste. Why is a vegetarian, if caste is a system based on purity and pollution, why is it that a vegetarian merchant is below the meat-eating king? Right? Why do upper caste on occasions beat the lower caste if there is consensus around the caste system? Why do untouchables of Tanjavur village believe that they would be struck by disease if a Brahmin were to enter their hamlet? Why is the Kshatriya model of Sanskritization dominant as against the Brahminical one? Example, Jats of UP, independent models of Sanskritization. So if it was all about the ritual hierarchy that Juma would have us believe, and it was all about hierarchy and not about difference, right? How do you answer these questions? And the fact that what I think Dipankar Gupta, M.N. Srinivas, G.S. Ghurre were all trying to say is that all castes reproduce caste, right? So there is a need to kind of be self-critical, and I think this question becomes even more pertinent now when in UP you have people like Mulayam Singh Yadav and others who kind of, in the name of identity politics, in the name of identity politics, are not able, who assert caste rights but forget about caste responsibilities, right? So if you have rights in terms of your identity, you also have certain responsibility vis-a-vis how your community behaves and treats other castes who are less privileged. If I were to come to power tomorrow on the basis of my caste, I come to power probably on the basis of the votes I get from my caste, but I come to power as a part of the Indian political system, and I then represent everybody. I just don't represent my caste. And if I'm not just representing my caste, I have to become the conscience keeper of my own community, right? And this factor becomes extremely fundamental, this idea that it's very simple to talk of hierarchy and badmouth hierarchy and not understand how difference reiterates caste. The principle of difference reiterates caste as much as hierarchy. Right? So every person who claims to, an identity based on caste should be equally aware of the responsibilities you have, right, vis-a-vis other communities. Right? So that is a fundamental question. I think many of these theories bring out all these kind of arguments that are made by Ghurre and Srinivas and Dipankar Gupta bring that out very clearly. When the rapes happened in UP, whether it's Mulayam Singh Yadav or whether it's Akhil Yadav, whichever Yadav, none of them came out in open to condemn and say that, okay, in our community if this is happening, no, it cannot happen. We have a right over our identity. Everybody has a right over their identity. But you also have certain responsibilities that come with it. And unless and until you wake up to those responsibilities, then the whole point of caste politics is lost. That is one argument I want to make very strongly. Right? So it's in this context that many of these scholars have also pointed out that what has happened is, as caste is getting politically conscious, each caste, whether it's the Yadav, the Kurmis, or the Koris, or you name it, anybody, or the Vellalas, or whoever, the Mudalayas and whoever, all getting conscious, the Kaudas, getting conscious of their caste is fine. But the more conscious they are getting, and more differences that they are, that is coming into them, there's greater caste solidarity that you see. There's greater differentiation of caste. Class differences will become greater, but there is also greater caste solidarity that is happening at the same time, which is dangerous. Because that caste solidarity is not self-critical. Any identity which is not self-critical is problematic. There's no harm in identity, but identity which is not self-critical becomes problematic. Then a fraternal basis of society is lost. Yeah. What I'm saying is, when in the modern democratic setup, when you're going into your caste identity, you cannot do away with your identity. You're born in that identity, you're living in that identity. And you then, when you take state power, when you come to you take over state power, then you're no longer just a representative of your community. Then you have to transcend your identity to represent all of the people who fall within that, state. Then you have to wake up to that responsibility. So then you have to become self-critical of belonging to a community that has come to power, who's pushed you to power, because many of the privileges now will come to those communities and they should not misuse it, isn't it? That is what I'm arguing. Now I'll just do the last bit on the Marxist understanding of caste, which basically argues for the economic basis of caste exploitation. Caste is not, this is Gerald Berman, who basically argued that caste was not just a system of exploitation, of inequality, but also a system of exploitation, because he said the caste system paid people on the basis of their status, but not on the basis of labor. Right? So he was basically arguing that it's a very unjust, unfair system, and that there is a material basis to caste. And then there is I'm rushing because only 5-10 minutes left. Then there is Joan Mencher. She did a study among the untouchables of UP, right? And here she captured an emic view of untouchability and the caste system. And when she, excuse me, I'm not over yet, right? So when she went up to the untouchables and said that, well, you people are supposed to be like, scum of the earth, you people don't work, you're lazy, that's why you're not progressing, and that's what. So they all started laughing, and they looked at her and said, you've spent too much time with the Brahmins or the upper caste, right? So the untouchables, when she asked them as to why they think, why are they in that abject condition that they are, they gave a very materialistic understanding of their condition and said, we don't own anything, we don't own land, we don't have property, we don't even own our own house. How are we supposed to really fight the system? So here, Mencher really comes up with a very materialistic understanding of caste, where caste is embedded in class relations. And she makes a case for that, because one of the things which is very critical in untouchability is also beef eating. Because untouchable communities eat beef, that has always become, and she argues how many of the community that she interacted with, they would insist on having beef as a significant aspect of their cultural identity. And they would say that if there was this one boy who went to the city, got educated, he stopped eating beef. So there was this great concern in the extended family that this boy has gone corrupt, he's forgotten his ways, and he's forgotten, the good aspects of our culture, and that somehow how he should be brought to have, get into having a beef. So she talks about how there's an alternative understanding of the caste system that emerges when you look at the caste system bottoms up, not ups, you look at it from the other end. And the second main argument she makes is, if you look at the population of the untouchables, the greatest concentration of large untouchable castes are found in irrigated wheat and rice regions of the Indo-Gangetic plains and the coastal belts of South India. These are all the areas in India which require labor, large amount of labor, and you find untouchable communities spread across these regions. So there is a kind sort of a historical relationship that she draws in the requirement of labor and the dominance of the untouchable communities in this area to make a case for a materialistic understanding of untouchability as well as the caste system. Okay, so the Marxist scholars have argued that the basis for caste discrimination is fundamentally class. Caste as fundamental in organizing the relations of production and reproduction, and it's important to recognize the material significance of caste. Caste and land control are closely associated. Last time I mentioned two case studies. I just want to briefly mention them again. I will send you back to those readings. One reading is by Andre Vete in Tamil Nadu, where he shows how the Brahmins who were at one point in time the landowners and had the ritual and economic and political power, gradually were literally thrown out of their position with subsequent reforms brought in by the state, land reforms as well as political reforms with the introduction of the Panchayati Raj, and how they lost their class status and only retained their status, social status, and even power slipped out of their hand. So he talks about how these three things happen, as against Anand Chakravarti, who basically argues or demonstrates how the agrarian class structure in Bihar is embedded in caste, in that whether a person controls land or not is conditioned by that person's caste status. So he actually shows in his study very clearly how, if you were to look at the land system in the village that in Purnia that he did, you can actually map castes along that scale, and that can be done actually much of India at this point in time. There's a close relationship between class and caste that you find in the agrarian structure in India, right? So these are the two examples where I want to send you back to really get a sense of how class and caste coincide and are correlated in the context of India. One case of Bete, where he's arguing that gradually that relationship got diluted in the case of Tamil Nadu, and that too because state power was taken over by the rebelling castes. The anti-caste movement really kind of marked the shift from power going from C. Rajagopalachari to Kamraj. And he brought very significant legislations to ensure that the Brahmins lost power and many of the non-Brahmins communities, came to power in the process. But in places like Bihar and UP, that shift or transfer of state power from the dominant to the other lesser privileged communities has not happened. And there you can see also again the class character of the state, which is dominated by caste. Whether you go to Bihar, UP, the state character is also dominated by this nexus between caste and class in India. So it so seems that not just caste, but caste in itself is, kind of constraining, but it also dominates much of our understanding of class in India as well as that of the state. Now, I'll give you a break and then you come back at 4:10. Professor Ramaiah is coming.